CHAPTER XXIV OF THE HAND OF Fu-Manchu. The Hand of Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. CHAPTER XXIV CAFÉ de l'Egypte. I could see that Nayland Smith counted the escape of the prisoner but a trivial matter by comparison with the discovery to which it had led us. That the Soho café should prove to be, if not the headquarters, at least a regular resort of Dr. Fu Manchu, was not too much to hope. The usefulness of such a haunt was evident enough, since it might conveniently be employed as a place of rendezvous for Orientals, and furthermore enable the cunning Chinaman to establish relations with persons likely to prove of service to him. Formerly he had used an East End opium den for this purpose, and, later, the resort known as the Joy Shop. Soho hitherto had remained outside the radius of his activity, but that he should have embraced it at last was not surprising, for Soho is the Montmartre of London, and a land of many secrets. "Why," demanded Nayland Smith, "have I never been told of the existence of this place?" "That's simple enough," answered Inspector Weymouth. "Although we knew of this Café de l'Egypte, we never had the slightest trouble there. It's a Bohemian resort, where members of the French colony, some of the Chelsea art people, professional models, and others of that sort, foregather at night. I've been there myself, as a matter of fact, and I've seen people well known in the artistic world come in. It has much the same clientele as, say, the Café Royal, with a rather heavier sprinkling of Hindu students, Japanese, and so forth. It's celebrated for Turkish coffee. What do you know of this Ismail?" "Nothing much. He's a Levantine Jew." "And something more," added Smith, surveying himself in the mirror and turning to nod his satisfaction to the well known perruquier whose services were sometimes requisitioned by the police authorities. We were ready for our visit to the Café de l'Egypte, and Smith having deemed it inadvisable that we should appear there openly, we had been transformed, under the adroit manipulation of Foster, into a pair of futurists oddly unlike our actual selves. No wigs, no false moustaches had been employed. A change of costume and a few deft touches of some water-color paint had rendered us unrecognizable by our most intimate friends. It was all very fantastic, very reminiscent of Christmas charades, but the farce had a grim, murderous undercurrent. The life of one dearer to me than life itself hung upon our success. The swamping of the white world by yellow hordes might well be the price of our failure. Weymouth left us at the corner of Frith Street. This was no more than a reconnaissance, but "I shall be within hail if I'm wanted," said the burly detective, and although we stood not in Chinatown, but in the heart of Bohemian London, with popular restaurants about us, I was glad to know that we had so staunch an ally in reserve. The shadow of the great Chinaman was upon me. That strange, subconscious voice, with which I had become familiar in the past, awoke within me tonight. Not by logic, but by prescience, I knew that the Yellow Doctor was near. 2 minutes' walk brought us to the door of the café. The upper half was of glass, neatly curtained, as were the windows on either side of it, and above the establishment appeared the words Café de l'Egypte. Between the second and third word was inserted a gilded device representing the crescent of Islam. We entered. On our right was a room furnished with marble-topped tables, cane-seated chairs, and plush-covered lounges set against the walls. The air was heavy with tobacco smoke. Evidently the café was full, although the night was young. Smith immediately made for the upper end of the room. It was not large, and at first glance I thought that there was no vacant place. Presently, however, I espied 2 unoccupied chairs, and these we took, finding ourselves facing a pale, bespectacled young man, with long, fair hair and faded eyes, whose companion, a bold brunette, was smoking one of the largest cigarettes I had ever seen in a gold and amber cigar-holder. A very commonplace Swiss waiter took our orders for coffee, and we began discreetly to survey our surroundings. The only touch of Oriental colour thus far perceptible in the Café de l'Egypte was provided by a red-capped Egyptian behind a narrow counter, who presided over the coffee pots. The patrons of the establishment were in every way typical of Soho, and in the bulk differed not at all from those of the better known café restaurants. There were several Easterns present, but Smith, having given each of them a searching glance, turned to me with a slight shrug of disappointment. Coffee being placed before us, we sat sipping the thick, sugary beverage, smoking cigarettes, and vainly seeking for some clue to guide us to the inner sanctuary consecrated to hashish. It was maddening to think that Karamaneh might be somewhere concealed in the building, whilst I sat there inert amongst this gathering whose conversation was of abnormalities in art, music, and literature. Then suddenly the pale young man seated opposite paid his bill, and with a word of farewell to his companion went out of the café. He did not make his exit by the door through which we entered, but passed up the crowded room to the counter whereat the Egyptian presided. From some place hidden in the rear emerged a black-haired, swarthy man, with whom the other exchanged a few words. The pale young artist raised his wide-brimmed hat and was gone, through a curtained doorway on the left side of the counter. As he opened it I had a glimpse of a narrow court beyond, then the door was closed again, and I found myself thinking of the peculiar eyes of the departed visitor. Even through the thick pebbles of his spectacles, although for some reason I had thought little of the matter at the time, his oddly contracted pupils were noticeable. As the girl in turn rose and left the café, but by the ordinary door, I turned to Smith. "That man," I began, and paused. Smith was watching covertly a Hindu seated at a neighbouring table, who was about to settle his bill. Standing up, the Hindu made for the coffee counter. The swarthy man appeared out of the opening, and the Asiatic visitor went out by the door opening into the court. One quick glance Smith gave me, and raised his hand for the waiter. A few minutes later we were out in the street again. "We must find our way to that court," snapped my friend. "Let us try back. I noted a sort of alleyway which we passed just before reaching the café." "You think the hashish den is in some adjoining building?" "I don't know where it is, Petrie, but I know the way to it." Into a narrow, gloomy court we plunged, hemmed in by high walls, and following it for 10 yards or more. An even narrower and less inviting turning revealed itself on the left. We pursued our way, and presently found ourselves at the back door of the Café de l'Egypte. "There's the door," I said. It opened into a tiny cul-de-sac, flanked by dilapidated hoardings, and no other door of any kind was visible in the vicinity. Nayland Smith stood tugging at the lobe of his ear almost savagely. "Where the devil did they go?" he whispered. Even as he spoke the words, came a gleam of light through the upper curtained part of the door, and I distinctly saw a figure of a man in silhouette. "Stand back!" snapped Smith. We crouched back against the dirty wall of the court, and watched a strange thing happen. The back door of the Café de l'Egypte opened outward; simultaneously a door, hitherto invisible, set at right angles in the hoarding adjoining, opened inward. A man emerged from the café and entered the secret doorway. As he did so, the café door swung back, and closed the door in the hoarding. "Very good," muttered Nayland Smith. "Our friend Ismail behind the counter moves some lever which causes the opening of one door automatically to open the other. Failing his kindly offices, the second exit from the Café de l'Egypte is innocent enough. Now, what is the next move?" "I have an idea, Smith!" I cried. "According to Morrison, the place in which the hashish may be obtained has no windows, but is lighted from above. No doubt it was built for a studio and has a glass roof. Therefore—" "Come along!" snapped Smith, grasping my arm. "You have solved the difficulty, Petrie." Chapter 25